So I'm going to quickly go through this on power sharing just to give you a bit more of a chance and an opportunity to go back over the notes. I understand this is one of the most difficult and challenging units within the Northern Ireland section of the GCSE, so it's definitely worth revisiting it. And it is one that hasn't been asked in great detail very often over the past few years, so it's something that could potentially be on this summer's examination. There's many different aspects to what you need to know. You'll need to know firstly the reasons for the introduction of a power sharing executive to Northern Ireland. You'll also be expected to be able to describe the reactions to power sharing when it's first introduced, and then also the reactions to the Sunningdale Agreement on the Council of Ireland. And then part of that, this next one, these next two really are very much the same. You'll be asked to describe the Ulster Worker Council strike and the impact that has, which ultimately you will see is the reintroduction of direct rule, which of course was first introduced in 1972 in March. Now, what is power sharing? Well, put simply, it is the forced sharing of power. You can see here, i.e. forcing nationalists and unionists to share government. We can see on the left-hand side of the screen, Brian Faulkner, the Ulster Unionist leader. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have Jerry Fitt, the leader of the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, which was the largest Catholic or nationalist party in Northern Ireland. So on the 20th of March 1973, almost a year since direct rule had been imposed in 1972 in Northern Ireland, the British government announced their plans for a new system of government, which was power sharing. And as I've said, that is the mandatory or forced sharing of government between two or more communities. There is no choice, it must be done. As part of power sharing, there would be a new power sharing assembly, which is the parliament, or in Germany what we would call the Reichstag, in America what they would call Congress. This is the body with all the politicians which comes together to vote. Think about it, an assembly like you would go to in school is when the entire year group is there. And the same is very true of the Northern Ireland Assembly that is set up in 1973, 1974. It's a parliament, okay? It's the name that is given for what previously would have been called the Stormont Parliament. And importantly about that parliament, it would be elected using a system called proportional representation. And proportional representation is very much, as the name implies. You can see here results from the 2017 Northern Ireland Assembly elections, which used proportional representation. And what that means is the seats, the representation of the seats that parties have in the Assembly, the Parliament, is roughly proportional to the share of the vote they get. So if you look at the two votes on the left, seats on the right of the top two pie charts, you can see the different colours are roughly proportional. They're very similar in terms of the number of seats awarded very closely matches the number of the percentage of votes that the party gained in the election. Contrast that with a non-proportional system like down the bottom, and you can see it produces results which are very different to how people voted. So in the case of the bottom here, you can see the Unionists in red or orange got about a third of the vote and yet got more than 50% of the seats. So this is why at the top, proportional representation is preferential, why it's preferred for power sharing. It prevents anyone from getting an outright majority, from having more than 50% of the seats, meaning that they, even if they wanted to go solo, which they can't under power sharing and try and govern by themselves, they're forced to share power with other political parties because they don't have enough seats to run and govern by themselves. So, as we've said, this new assembly is going to use proportional representation, so the seats will roughly match the shares of the vote. And you can see I've given you a definition there, a voting system to make sure the politicians elected, or the number of politicians elected, I should say, closely reflects the parties that the public voted for. This meant that neither a Unionist or Nationalist party would be big enough to govern alone. They would have to work together as power sharing required, forced to share power. There was also going to be a new power sharing executive. An executive is another word for the government. So if assembly is the parliament, if the assembly is the Reichstag, if the assembly is the Congress, then the executive is, your Führer. It is your president in America. It is the government of the country. The new government would not have control over justice and security, and it was also agreed that a Council of Ireland would be created. And this Council of Ireland was in effect an Irish dimension in the governance of Northern Ireland, meaning that it was a little slither of input from the Republic of Ireland with regards to control and governing Northern Ireland. And the Council of Ireland was a body consisting of politicians from north and south of the border working together on common issues. So it was basically a talking shop, a way for politicians from the north and the south to come together to talk about issues which affected the island. Of course, nationalists are going to be very, very happy about that. Unionists, on the other hand, less so, because any step towards working with a republic is seen as a large step towards a united Ireland. And unsurprisingly, for that reason, unionists are split on the idea of sharing power. Um, some unionists favour it, some unionists, unsurprisingly, are very much against it. The leader of the OUP, Brian Faulkner, supports power sharing, but most unionists did not support power sharing. All the unionists against power sharing joined together to form an anti-power sharing group of unionists, which was called the United Ulster Unionist Council, or the Triple UC. And it's important to differentiate this because we will see later on there will be the UUC, so we need to know which is which. So the United Ulster Unionist Council is essentially a united group of Ulster unionists who are against power sharing, who are against Brian Faulkner's decision to take part in power sharing. And it includes, not surprisingly, DUP, the party of Ian Paisley, the man who's very much against any input from the Republic of Ireland, the Ulster Vanguard, set up by William Craig, who we know is also another hardline unionist figure, and even some members of the OUP, even some members of Brian Faulkner's own party do not support power sharing, and they stand as part of this United Ulster Unionist Council against power sharing in the elections. So in June 1973, the elections to this new Northern Ireland Assembly using proportional representation are held. Unionist opposition now threatened to destroy power sharing before it had even begun. Reason being, it's in the name, power sharing, you have to share power. Power sharing does not work if both communities are not fully behind it, and we can see here unionists are not fully behind it. When the elections took place in June 1973, the results were damning for Faulkner. Faulkner's pro-power sharing unionists, those in favour of sharing power with nationalists, got less votes than those who were against power sharing. So we can see it's easier, there is percentages there if you want them. I prefer to go with seats because it's easier to remember, and that's what CCEA uses in the mark scheme. Those unionists who were against power sharing, who were split away against power sharing, the UUUC, you can see them on the right-hand side of the screen, they won 26 seats. However, those unionists led by Brian Faulkner, who we can see on the left side of the screen, only won 24 seats. So this result suggests more unionists were against power sharing than were in favour of it, which is a big problem because, as I said, they're needed in order for power sharing to work. Despite the division amongst unionists, well, the British pressed ahead anyway. They did not want direct rule to continue. They wanted to try and deal with the issues in Northern Ireland, and they were willing to push ahead and try and set up a power sharing government to try and solve the issue, the fighting, the conflict that had been raging since the 1960s. And the reason they press ahead, not something I imagine you would need in your exam, but still to help you understand, the majority of people in Northern Ireland, not unionists, majority of all people, nationalists, unionists, others, voted for pro-power sharing parties, 63%. The problem is the overwhelming majority of that 63% are from a nationalist or other background. A little of them in comparison are from a unionist background, which means 63%, more than half of the people in the country, it looks like power sharing is popular. But again, power sharing is about both communities sharing power, and we know, if I go back, unionists are divided. Okay, more unionists are against power sharing than in favour. Now, eventually, a new executive was announced. This is the government. The new government was set up and is announced on the 21st of November 1973. It would have 11 government ministries, always known as departments, like Department of Health, Department of Education, etc. So Minister for Health, Minister for Education. 6 ministers were held by unionists. For example, one they held was education. 4 ministers were from the SDLP, and they, for example, their housing. Of course, nationalists are really motivated by housing, what with it having been a big issue throughout the 1960s in Northern Ireland. And one ministry would be held by the Alliance Party, and that was law reform. Okay. The leader of the executive then would be the leader from the biggest group, and that was the pro power sharing unionists. And that means Brian Faulkner was the chief executive, is his name, the chief of the executive, the leader. His deputy would be the leader of the SDLP, a nationalist, Jerry Fitt, because of course, if you have a unionist leader, you must have a nationalist deputy leader, and vice versa. And there you can see the physical makeup of the power sharing executive. Now, Northern Ireland had a government, as we see, right in front of us, with our 6 unionist ministers, 4 nationalists, and 1 alliance. And it had an assembly and a parliament which had been put together, as we saw in the election results of June 1973. All that remained was to reach an agreement on this Council of Ireland, this body of politicians from the north and the south. They need to reach an agreement as to what that will look like, and what, more importantly here, what power will that body, that Council of Ireland, have. And that leads us to the Sunningdale Agreement of 1974, an agreement on the Council of Ireland and what powers it would have. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen the 4 main individuals involved in that Sunningdale Agreement. You've got Liam Cosgrave, the Irish Taoiseach. You've got Edward Heath, the British Prime Minister. You've got the second to last on the right, you can see Brian Faulkner, the unionist leader, the official unionist leader. And at the very end, wearing the glasses, we've got Jerry Fitt, the leader of the SDLP, the largest nationalist party. So, as part of Sunningdale, discussions began between the British and Irish governments and the major parties of the Assembly who were in favour of power sharing on the 6th of December 1973. And it took place at Sunningdale, hence why it's called the Sunningdale Agreement. The meeting brought together a powerful group of politicians, as I said, from Britain, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. However, no politicians against power sharing were present at the meeting. Some were invited to come and offer their views, but they were not allowed to be part of the negotiations, namely William Craig and Ian Paisley. Why? Why were they excluded? Well, they were never going to agree to the Republic of Ireland having any influence or say in Northern Ireland, and so therefore there'd be no point in inviting them. Paisley and Craig would make it their mission from the beginning to destroy these talks because they didn't want any outcome with the Republic of Ireland having an influence or say over Northern Ireland. So there's no point in inviting them. It would just destroy the talks before they even began. There you can see, you might want to pause here, but you can see the different people from the United Kingdom, Republic of Ireland, the OUP, the SDLP, and the Alliance Party who were all present at these talks. The most important, of course, I should point out, are the British Prime Minister, the Irish Taoiseach, the Chief Executive, Brian Faulkner, and the Deputy Chief Executive, Jerry Fitt, the Deputy Leader. This then is what is agreed at Stormont. So this, at Sunningdale. This is what is agreed. It's the terms of that. You may get a question, describe a term of the Sunningdale Agreement. You could, in theory, get a 9-marker asking you what was agreed at Sunningdale, and you would have to talk about all of this in order to get any 9 marks out of it, but I don't see that being a very likely question. So the first thing that's agreed is a council of members would be set up, which would have 14 members. And the whole point of this council of members, of ministers, of people from the north and the south of Ireland, the governments of the north and the south of Ireland, the whole point of it was to try and develop north-south communications, to have the ministers of both governments, the government of Northern Ireland, the power sharing government, and the government of the Republic of Ireland, sitting down together and talking. Secondly, and this is a rather easy one to understand, London agreed that it would support Irish unity if it was supported by the majority of people in Northern Ireland. Think about majority, you're thinking votes. So essentially, if the people of Northern Ireland voted in a referendum, a vote to accept Irish unity, London would allow that to happen. The Irish government then makes its own, or has its own area, which it agrees to, like the London government, and that is that Dublin recognises that Irish unity can only ever be achieved by peaceful matters, not through political violence. And a lovely phrase that you can use at the bottom here then is that it would require the consent of the people. Essentially, if Irish unity is ever going to take place, the people of Northern Ireland must consent to it. It cannot be forced upon them. And that means having to convince unionists to vote for it. Number four, then you can see that it's been agreed, is that there was a 60-member consultative assembly elected by the Dáil. The Dáil is the Irish Parliament. And so you can see that word consultative here. It's not a very powerful body. It's simply there to inform, to educate, to consult, and it's simply there, almost like again like a talking shop. It's there to offer an opinion, to offer advice, and it's nothing powerful. It doesn't have any real true power or say over um, Northern Ireland itself. But that would be created with members from the Dáil. So you know their version of Irish MPs, members of Parliament, the Dáil would elect 60 of those to this assembly so they could be consulted on matters. And the last area, which is a nice, easy one to remember as well, number five, is that security control would remain in British hands. So security control was the thing which collapsed Stormont in the first place. Heath demanded that it be handed over. Faulkner refused. At this point in time, power sharing, we haven't seen if it can work yet. We haven't seen if it can be effective yet. Heath would still be a bit cautious to hand control of the army of security control back over to the Stormont government, even in um, a new government with power sharing now, as opposed to just the unionist government. So the British opt to keep control of security for the time being, but there is the prospect that in the future security control could be devolved or transferred to this new power sharing executive at Stormont. Now, problems with the Sunningdale Agreement, and it really comes down to perception here. Both unionist and nationalist politicians had very different interpretations of what the Sunningdale Agreement meant, and mostly on what the Council of Ireland was there for is the thing they kind of have different opinions on. The SDLP, the largest nationalist party led by Jerry Fitt, thought that the Sunningdale Agreement would allow for closer ties between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And he thinks this because, this new council of members has been set up, because there's this 60-member consultative assembly elected by the Dáil. However, Brian Faulkner, the leader of the unionist grouping, the OUP, the chief of the executive, thought of it as just a token body, which he agreed to as a way of getting Dublin to accept Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. So he thinks it's really just there to persuade Dublin to accept Northern Ireland as British, and that they could only have, again going back here, that Dublin could only have a united Ireland through the consent of the people, and that's really why he accepts it. He thinks of it just as a token body set up to get Dublin to agree that Northern Ireland is British, and that's a problem because you have the nationalists thinking this is now created and has the opportunity to create stronger links between the north and the south. Faulkner, on the other hand, doesn't really think anything's changed. He thinks that this is just, as I said, that way of getting Dublin to accept Northern Ireland as British. And this leads then, this along with the agreement itself, leads to a wide scale of reactions to Sunningdale. Okay, and we can see this unionist poster on the left-hand side. Dublin is just a Sunningdale away, vote unionist. And what this is implying is that Dublin, Ireland, a united Ireland, uh, is just a Sunningdale away. Sunningdale is a stepping stone towards United Ireland. And you can see at the bottom that motivation, if you want to stop this, if you want to go in the opposite direction from Dublin, if you want to move away from any idea or any thought or any possibility of United Ireland, vote unionist. Okay. Now, firstly, we have the reactions of nationalists, and they're lukewarm from Republicans. Lukewarm is in not too hot, not too cold. It is slightly positive, slightly warm, but not to a great extent. Um, they thought Sunningdale delivered much less than what they hoped for. In other words, they didn't think it went far enough. And the IRA shows its own real disregard for this Sunningdale agreement when it continues to carry out its campaign, as seen with a series of bombs in 1973 in London on the week before Christmas. Okay. Unionists, on the other hand, well, unsurprisingly, bit divided. On the 10th of December, loyalist paramilitaries, in response to what they've seen agreed at Sunningdale, uh, form a new Ulster Army Council to resist any Irish dimension in Northern Ireland, any involvement of Dublin in Northern Ireland. After the executive set for the first time, the government set for the first time, the new power sharing government, in January 1974, the Ulster Unionist Council, which was the ruling body of the OUP, voted to reject Sunningdale. And this creates a massive headache for Brian Faulkner. Now, don't get this mixed up with the Triple UC, the United Ulster Unionist Council. That's something different. That's the anti-power sharing unionists we mentioned earlier on. The Ulster Unionist Council, the best way I can describe it is they are the leaders of the OUP. If you think of a football club or if you think of a business, if the OUP was a business or if the OUP was a football club, then the Ulster Unionist Council would be the board of that club or that business. So they're still part of the OUP, but they are the decision makers at the top who are in charge of running the party. And that is a big problem because, as you see, on January 4th, they vote to reject Sunningdale. The leader of the OUP, Brian Faulkner, helped to negotiate Sunningdale. He signed the Sunningdale Agreement, and yet his own party's ruling body, right, the Ulster Unionist Council, the board of his party, has voted to reject it. So now Faulkner is at odds with his own party, and he's forced to resign as OUP leader, and he's replaced with a man called Harry West. Faulkner, I should point out, doesn't go away. He and the other unionists who are in favour of power sharing continue as pro-power sharing unionists, and the OUP just takes a decision then, now a separate party, nothing to do with Faulkner, to stand against power sharing and against the Sunningdale Agreement. There is an election then, which takes place in February 1974. This is different from the Assembly election we mentioned earlier on. There's two elections here we don't need to muddle up. One is the June 1973 election, where more unionists are returned who are against power sharing than in favour. This is something different. This is the February 1974 British general election, and it takes place. And Jerry Fitt, I should say, and this comes up in the CMR scheme on the one time this question's been asked. Jerry Fitt thought this was too soon as people were still confused about power sharing and what it meant. So he thinks this is too soon. They're tempting fate. They should hold off before any elections take place to give power sharing a chance to work. And he's right. 11 out of the 12 seats in the British Parliament that were elected from Northern Ireland were won by anti-Sunningdale politicians. The United Ulster Unionist Council, the UUUC, the Triple UC, those politicians who at the very start were unionists but against power sharing, against Sunningdale. 367,000 unionists in Northern Ireland vote for anti-Sunningdale candidates, those from the UUC. Only 94,000 unionists voted for pro-Sunningdale parties. So the overwhelming majority of unionists do not support Sunningdale. And again, that's a problem because it's part of this power sharing system, and you can't have power sharing without both sides being committed to it. Unionists have now overwhelmingly rejected the Sunningdale Agreement. And the UUC argues that Sunningdale and power sharing should be scrapped, as it's been demonstrated in this election result. So many are against it. The British government, however, once again, reject this because they want to deal with the problem of Northern Ireland. So feeling like they have no other option, unionists who are against the Sunningdale Agreement decide that they are going to go on a strike. And the big thing that causes this strike is that on the 14th of May, this Northern Ireland Assembly or Parliament, or their version of the Reichstag, voted to continue its support for the Sunningdale Agreement, not to change it, but to continue to support it. And this leads to a general strike. A general strike, you can see here, it doesn't matter if you can't remember what it is in your exam, as long as you know the word. But a general strike is a strike involving workers across lots of different sectors, lots of different businesses, lots of different industries. And they're striking because they're unhappy with something, in this case, Sunningdale. It's organised by something called the Ulster Workers' Council. So it's a council of workers across Northern Ireland, which was a group of Protestant trade unions, the UWC. I know another acronym, I apologise. And this was, as I said, a group of Protestant trade unionists, and they had strong political and paramilitary support from unionists and loyalists, which will make it easier for them during their strike. Because initially, support for the strike was limited, it was small. However, as I said, they had strong political and paramilitary support in particular. And one loyalist paramilitary is really significantly here, the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, uses intimidation to encourage people to take part in this strike, this Ulster Workers' Council strike against Sunningdale. By the end of the week, much of Northern Ireland had come to a standstill. Industries closed down. There were regular blackouts because there was not enough power workers. Fuel supplies were being strictly controlled, and hundreds of Ulster Defence Association or UDA roadblocks have been set up across Northern Ireland. There is an attempt by rival trade unionists to actually get people to go back to work. However, it's a complete failure. This back to work demonstration, when on the 21st of May, only 200 people show up. Here you can see members of the UDA. Here you can see examples of roadblocks. And here you can see lots of people from the agriculture industry, farmers, etc., protesting against Sunningdale outside on the lanes, as you can see just about in the background there, the lane up towards Stormont. As part of the reaction then, there's also increased loyalist violence. On May 17th, tensions get worse and they increase further as car bombs were exploded in the Republic of Ireland, in Dublin and Monaghan. Planted by loyalists, as I said, 27 people are killed. 5 later die from their injuries. You can see some images here of the explosions in Dublin and Monaghan. The British government response, strong against the strikers, but it creates problems in itself. Harold Wilson, remember we were talking about Edward Heath at the beginning. Edward Heath lost an election and was replaced by Harold Wilson and the Labour Party, who returned to power. Despite having 17,500 British troops in Northern Ireland, the army is hesitant to get involved and break up the Ulster Worker Council strike because they think it's a political matter and it will only cause further tension and alienation if they get involved. So on the 25th of May, the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, loses patience and he goes on national television to make an address to the nation. In this speech that Wilson delivers, he denounces or criticised or attacks the strikers, calling them spongers. This angers unionists and ensures the strike continues to go ahead. Here you can see a quote from Wilson's speech about the Ulster Worker Council strike in a broadcast, as I said, on the 25th of May. He says, "The strike is a deliberate and calculated attempt to use every undemocratic and unparliamentary means for the purpose of bringing down the whole constitution of Northern Ireland so as to set up a sectarian and undemocratic state from which 1/3 of people will be excluded." He goes on to talk about how British people have seen their sons spat at and vilified, how their taxes poured into Northern Ireland to repair the damage of violence caused by the people from Northern Ireland. And at the very bottom, you'll see here, he says, these people that you're talking about in Northern Ireland, those on strike, spend their lives sponging on Westminster and British democracy and then systemically assault democratic methods. Who do these people think they are? So he's furious, but this only ignites further fury within unionists themselves, who are angry at being criticised by Wilson and continue their strike. Wilson orders British troops to take over fuel supplies. This is a line that comes up in the mark scheme whenever it's appeared. The Ulster Workers' Council retaliates by ordering a complete and total shutdown across Northern Ireland. With the British government and the SDLP refusing to negotiate with the UWC, the Ulster Workers' Council, Brian Faulkner and the other unionists resign from the power sharing executive. They realise there's too much opposition amongst unionists, very little unionist support power sharing. They're against this. Without any unionist involvement, power sharing was now effectively dead. You can't have power sharing without two sides to share power, and there's no unionists involved anymore. The Ulster Workers' Council strike had been effective, and the strike was called off on the 29th of May as a result. Wilson then suspends the assembly on the 30th of May because it can't run, and direct rule is once again introduced in Northern